Yeah, I can see your screen.
Okay.
Yeah, so I cannot see your camera, and would you please share the video with us too? Yeah, I can
Sounds
see you,
coming
right?
through.
Yeah, thank you. And do you have some video or audio in your PowerPoint?
No, I do not.
Okay, so that's great. Thank you for joining us. And can you give us a brief introduction about yourself?
Sure. So my name's Jerry Power. I'm CEO of i3 Systems. i3 Systems is a company that's formed to sort of help build data communities. And what we think about is not the power of using the data you have, but how can you take your data, combine it with other people's data so that when you run AI or other data analytics, the insights you derive extend outside of maybe your organizational boundaries. Okay, so it's
Yeah,
really about how do you think about data as part of a community where the insights you want to derive come from that community. And part of the trick in doing this is that people understand that their data has value. They're protection of it. They want to protect it. So when you put them in an environment where they're sharing data, you have to give them a degree of transparency, incentives. You have to create an environment where people feel comfortable to share their data. And that's really the part that we're sort of working on.
yeah, yeah, the data value. Yeah,
Should we just get into it?
yeah. I
Okay,
think,
no problem.
yeah, Jason, do you have something to say?
Yeah, I think we can start from, hey, Jerry, nice to meet you again.
Hi, Jason.
I think, last time we meet each other in person is last year, we have a meeting in USC. Okay,
Yes.
thank you for your support, at the US ideas, community. And that's a great news, for your company. Okay, so we will start from 3 p.m. I know, a lot of, attendees, they may get in on the perfect time. So let's just, have a small break, maybe or only, 1 minute. We will start from 3 p.m. Okay.
I will let you, when you say go, we'll start.
I know, you are the experts, in Southern California area about, IoT. So we are so excited to, waiting for your presentation about this talk. Is great. And also, I think IoT is a very hot, popular technology recently, especially edge, computing, put the AI technology into the IoT. A lot of, things. Okay, so I think, we can start at 3 p.m. Thank you again, and thank you for your support at Ideas, community.
Absolutely.
I start.
Okay, we can start now. Okay, we cannot, waiting for that. Okay, Jerry, you can go.
All right, so start screen sharing.
Everything looks good. It's already full screen.
So you've got the title slide? I'm seeing the video, I see myself. All right. So hello everybody. My name is Jerry Power. I'm CEO of i3 Systems. We're a relatively new company here in the Los Angeles area. For the last 6 years, I was doing research and teaching business, working a lot with a school, engineering school, Viterbi at USC. Prior to that, I have 30 years doing work in the telecommunications industry. So a lot of things sort of came together and we're talking about today's topic. I want to start by telling you we're talking about data sharing in a community and what is a community. Sometimes people think of communities as being sort of smart cities. I prefer the word smart community, and I do that because in some cases, cities do form a community. I mean, well, they do form a community, but in some cases there are non-city organizations that sort of work together as a community. In sort of a very open sense. If you think of like the Hollywood Business Improvement District, that is a community where they can work together to achieve things that an individual merchant might not be able to do. So there's lots of examples of organizations that are not necessarily cities, but they have some of the similar goals and problems that cities have when we start talking about data and how do we achieve more with the data we have. So so I'm sort of thinking a little bit about this as I prepare for today. And part of it is that there's not really a good definition of what is a smart community, what is a smart city. And I know that there are some people who sort of make the assumption, well, if we just start digitizing things, we become a smart community. And that makes you maybe a digital community, but it's not quite to where a smart community is. There are examples of cities that have deployed smart applications. They go buy an application, deploy it. They say, there, we've deployed this application. We're now a smart community. And I don't think that that quite really fills the bill as being a smart community either. Sometimes, and the cities, for example, the city of LA has got some really great smart applications out there. And that's really good. They're trying to facilitate digitization of the residents' access to the city so that ultimately, and this is important during times of COVID, you could have a zero-touch city. But that in itself, it doesn't make a smart community. Smart communities, there are lots of cities who sort of tried to deploy some of these technologies in a small neighborhood in a little area and saying, well, therefore we're a smart community, but that's not really it either, because you've sort of not tried to support the entire community, just a very small subset of it. I think smart communities do all those things. So I'm not saying that if you do these things, you're not on your way to being a smart community, but you have to do all those things. But I think what makes, in my mind, in my definition, a smart community is not just the digital and the application of technology, but how you do it. And that you want to make sure that each step as you start going down the road of becoming a smart community actually makes the next step a little bit easier. So that it sort of becomes a platform for growth, and the city takes on a commitment that over time they're going to continue to use data and digital technologies to continually improve their efficiency as an organization and the services that they provide to the community that they support. So it's really, I think a smart community is really a very long-term kind of commitment. There are big benefits in doing this. I've been listening through some of the sessions today, and we talk about the benefits that are there, but how do you manage the data that achieves those benefits? And that's a very complicated process to sort of go through that. When you talk to people who have done things, sometimes they'll tell you that they sort of limit the scope and they'll do a project in a single department. Because if you reduce the size of the community, so you're only talking to one department, it makes the problem easier. One of the things you can do to make the problem easier is you can avoid doing reconfigurations or optimizations. If you deploy a data-driven system, realize that you're not deploying just for a point in time, but there's a life cycle involved in that. And you need to evolve the system, let the data evolve, and be able to do that. The other thing that has to happen is you have to start thinking about projects and data reuse. So if you deploy a project where it's using data and it might be working, but the data is only being used for that one application, that sort of gives you a very limited scope as to what you can do with the data. And instead, you should be trying to reuse the data coming from one source as many times in as many different ways as possible. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through my slides. The other thing that I point out is that there are lots of lock-in strategies as you start heading down this road that you'll discover. And part of when you try and build a data community, you have to imagine that your policies are going to change, that over time, new vendors are going to appear with new ideas. There will be new algorithms, and all these things are going to happen over the life of the system. So your system has to be designed and developed in a way that it allows you to evolve your system as the technology, as the world around you evolves. And if you don't do that, you'll end up in a very dark alley someday. So that's not a good thing. So these are kind of some of the things that I think about, and how do we build these smart communities that are both evolvable and very on target. But there's really a lack of tools that let people sort of manage these kinds of environments. In a lot of cases, the data is looked at as almost a consumable, that it drives an application, and once it drives the application, its value is done. Instead of thinking about data as an asset, which is owned by the community, and the last speaker talked about the financial issues. If you think about finance and how do you measure the success of a bank, you measure the success of the bank by how often it can reuse its assets at asset turn rate. Basically, we want to sort of be able to take on that same philosophy in a data network, whereas the more you can reuse a data, the greater the value of the data system that it drives. It fits in line well. If you start, it's kind of interesting to me that if you start thinking about big data and AI, but change data to be money, a lot of the word money, just change it in a sentence. And if it reads still as a coherent sentence, it probably means you're on the right path. Because a lot of the things that we've done in the financial markets, we really need to sort of take some of those concepts and apply them to the data market. So what is i3 trying to do? That was just sort of a philosophical aside. So one of the things we're trying to do is we're creating a data management hub so that as the IoT networks drive growth, they can be managed by a team of experts. If you don't want to be building an IoT or a data structured system where all of a sudden you become, the albatross is how can you manage the data? You need to be able to allow it to grow in a structured and managed way. So it's also just not unconstrained growth either. You need to build a management framework so that the people who are in charge of the data, it's not a central IT department, but so that the people who own the data actually have management say and can control what happens to the data that they generate. It's a very federated way to sort of think about how do data from a bunch of different sources come together, but still operate cohesively without people losing their independent control. You have to make it easy for applications to find the data source that they need and connect to the places that they want. We talked to some application developers and who are working on AI projects, some really fascinating things. And they confidentially will tell us that they can spend 85% of their time trying to find the data they need to let their application work. And even once you find the data, you have to then sort of build a relationship with the source of the data to sort of make sure the data flows, because if the data stops flowing, the value of the application drops. Sometimes that's done by paying money to companies, so there's a cost associated with it. But if you're trying to generate primary data, you actually have to build customer relationships with those customers who are giving you the data so that the data continues to flow. And that's a really hard problem. To the example I was thinking of, if a company is spending 80% of its time just trying to get the data that it wants, and it's really only doing 20% of its time on data analytics, you know that's a lot of time being wasted. The other thing is that you have to be able to understand and facilitate the exchange of data policies, contracts, incentives, and things like that. If you're creating, if your data system is run by a central IT department that can say, all right, everybody, here's the IoT devices we're going to draw, here are the policies we're all going to adhere to, and because it's a private entity, they can pretty much force everybody to follow those rules. But in an open community, a data-driven community, there's not a central person who can do that. And if a central team tries to say, here are the rules and here's what we're going to do, what it actually ends up doing is it'll end up upsetting some of the people who are giving you the data, and they'll leave the community. So you have to be much more democratic about how you share information and giving people choices to what they want to participate in and what they don't want to do. And then the third thing that we're trying to do as part of this is build a system that's designed for growth. And that is something that lets you start small and lets you grow over time. Data, I mean, despite the fact that we have great conferences and all this AI stuff, it's really at its infancy. I mean, technology has gotten to where we can instrumentize just about anything. There's lots of stuff that's out there waiting to create and give us data, but people just have to ask for it. It's getting cheaper to do that. There's going to be much more data. And I think even as we think of AI, which right now largely runs on offline data stored in files, at some point, all those AI processes will start running against real-time digital twins of the information that's out in the world, and that will accelerate, and we'll start using AI more and more for direct operational decision making. So it's a long path to go in front of us as to what we're doing in the space. I'm glad for having this conference to do it. Now, the way we do this is what we've done is if you think about legacy, the way smart communities, smart applications have been deployed, people either start with an application and say, all right, let me deploy devices that generate the data I need, and they'll feed my applications. The alternate around that is sort of who are generating data, and then you say, let me find an application that can do that. What you do then is in software, you sort of set the parameters, you hardwire, and from then on forward, those devices feed that application. The end result is you end up with a very silo structured IT system, which works fine for that single application for those devices. But when you start thinking about how do we evolve and make that go as it goes forward, it gets difficult. And so what we're envisioning doing is putting a very small, thin hub in between the application and the devices. And this serves as sort of a data management tool so that the devices will feed their data into i3, the i3 would feed it into the applications. When you want to deploy new devices, you simply add them into the i3 system without really having to go back and touch the application. Or if you want to have the device now rehome and send its data to another application, you simply change the pointers inside the i3 system. And this saves you from having to go back and reprogram a whole lot of application and a whole lot of devices, which is really difficult to do. So that's kind of what this is. For those of us who've been around a while, if you think about the way the internet evolved starting out as a bunch of silos in its early years. I'm going back into the 90s, but over time, it slowly evolved to becoming much more of a structured organization where there were routers and hubs and everything sort of managed in a much easier way to flow things. The other thing too is when you start following more of a structured environment, the whole system becomes much more easier to diagnose and maintain because you can go look at one place. You can say, here's the way the data is supposed to flow. It's flowing that way, it's not. Generate traffic and wellness reports, and that helps the reliability of the system overall. Now, when we start thinking about data hubs and communities, you really have to think about things differently. Because you don't have that central part who could say, here's what we're doing and here's where we're going. Because it's not just connecting data to flow from an IoT device into an application. You have to think about things like, what are the legal requirements that we have to do? If the two partners are there, do they have policies that need to be matched and aligned with each other? Are there government objectives that need to be considered? What are the abilities of the staff on the individual sides? Because you don't have control over these things. And even though we talk about legal things, of course, the power of the press is important. And if anybody does anything that seems unwieldy, you could find yourself on a front page newspaper anytime. So you really have to even think beyond what just the requirements are and sort of be prepared to sort of do better than what the minimum level of requirements. And this is really important. So a lot of taking care and putting these networks together, although there's a lot of technology involved in doing it, it turns out that the really hard problems are how do you manage these kinds of issues about privacy, security, and policy, which are really very human issues. How do you set up that environment? And the technology is sort of the path that gets you there, but it's not the problem. Now, of course, if we get this whole thing together, once we do, and this will start to happen over time, is that we start thinking about the Internet of Things and the data it generates. it drives that data up to, and this is an AI conference, so it drives that data up into an artificial intelligence layer, into big data lakes where it's analyzed, they forecast and identify the trends. That's like a really important part of this. But those identification of trends and here's what's going on, for that to have value, it's got to drive a process that drives data, that drives action. If you can say, here's what's going on, and now sort of maybe you send a policeman to a place that a policeman wasn't called to, or maybe now because you know the demand is going to shift from product A to product B, now you shift warehouse production systems. So analyzing the data is an important part of it, but that data has to drive action. The action then sometimes, and here I drew IoT to talk about this cycle, because IoT is not just sensor data, but there's also actuators. So you can use that action to automatically maybe change what production is coming off of an assembly line, or maybe change the way delivery trucks are being routed through the streets. When that happens, the data changes, you can reanalyze, now you drive more action. So there ends up being this very productive cycle that forms between the technologies that fit together into this ecosystem, which is fascinating to think about as we start making AI systems not just an offline analytics tool, but something that drives the way we run the world and the way we think about things. So I have some examples in the slides. I'd like to go through kind of quick. So everything so far sounds a little bit theoretical, but one of the things that we're looking at is how can we use video better, and this is specifically in a city environment. If you think about the vehicles that a city owns, and I think the city of LA has north of 10,000 different vehicles that they own and run through the streets every day. There are police cars, there are trucks that run around to check on the conditions of the road, there's buses, there's garbage trucks. These vehicles are continually driving up and down the streets every day. A lot of them have video cameras, but the video cameras are aimed at a very specific function. I mean, even the policemen have body cams on them. The buses, the information is more about safety and about traffic accidents. Actually, and even on garbage trucks, it's interesting that the cameras on garbage trucks are aimed at the forks in front of the truck. You know, those forks that lift the garbage dumpsters and empty them in the back of the truck. What they do is they make sure that the forks are all the way down, or all the way up before the car starts to drive, and make sure that the forks go all the way down before they try and get under it, which is a very valuable thing to do because it could be catastrophe if it wasn't in the proper place when you start driving. But that same video in all of these vehicles has other uses too. You could use that same video, aim it at the streets, and be collecting data about where are the potholes in the streets. Not only just where are the data, but you can measure, like, this pothole is getting bigger by 1/4 of a centimeter every week. And if you know that, you can sort of forecast and sort of say, all right, we're going to have to go out and repair it sometime in the next 3 months. And if you know there's a cluster of potholes that all need to be repaired in a similar time frame, you can now use that knowledge, and instead of sending out a road repair crew each time a pothole needs to be fixed, which means they go to the depot, get their supplies, get a crew of people, drive out, fix the pothole, drive back, restock. You could actually load them up with enough stuff. They go out and hit 3 or 4 potholes going right down the street, drive back. Much more efficient way to sort of run and how you manage. It also makes the city much more proactive, instead of right now waiting for citizens to sort of take their cell phone, take a picture and say, hey, there's a pothole, I want to complain about my city. You guys should have taken care of this. There's other things that can be done with video. There are a couple of the pictures on the slides. You can use video to identify where there's graffiti. And then use that, just like the pothole, to schedule crews to go out and erase the graffiti and get that off of there. Driving up and down the streets, you can see if there's something sitting out on the sidewalk, a big object that's not supposed to be there. In the one picture there on the slide, it shows somebody put a desk out there. The sanitation people didn't pick it up because it wouldn't go in the dumpster. So now it just sits there for maybe a couple of weeks. But you could register that device that's there and send out a crew to pick it up. One of the pictures also shows, like, here's an alleyway that's sort of become overgrown because people aren't cutting the grass. Maybe that same camera can identify those things. What we're talking about doing when you think about this is we're talking about a video camera that might have been put on a sanitation truck, which is an asset to the sanitation department for sure. But we're saying, well, why don't we take that asset that's on a city truck and make it an asset to the entire city so that everybody can use the data to make all the departments much more effective and operational. So it's an interesting thing to think about. This is sort of a different project that we're working on. This is called a parking finder application. Right now, everybody in LA hates parking. I mean, you drive a half an hour to go to someplace you want to go. You can spend another half an hour, maybe even an hour, looking for a parking place. Well, maybe not during times of COVID. But that situation, everybody sort of experienced it. And it would be so much more convenient if you could sort of say to an application and say, instead of directing me to Staples Center, direct me to a parking place that's available, and maybe even pre-reserve the parking place. Now, right now, a lot of places are trying to do things like that, but each site that's doing it is doing it differently. They're using different technology. They have different data, different protocols. So you end up with this real hodgepodge of data sort of driving the city. And nobody wants to like go to the Joe's parking application, the Atlas parking application, the city application, hunt through applications looking for a parking place. What we're trying to do is build an application that takes all the data from all these parking places, bring it together, and let people sort of see, here's the composite inventory of parking that's available across Los Angeles. And when I should even say that when we do this, so there's different data from different sources being aggregated together to serve a community. But our definition of the community in the sense of this application is not the city of Los Angeles, but is really the Los Angeles basin. So we're trying to actually start being able to build data so that you don't just get the data from one city, but now you can look at the whole area and say, here's where parking. And we've been able to integrate data from Los Angeles Airport, from USC, from city, from county, from Long Beach. So we've already done enough of product demonstrations to show that this is indeed possible to do it. And we're slowly moving forward on sort of realizing what this vision is to sort of serve the community, the larger community, not just the city of LA, the whole Los Angeles area better. Now, one of my first comments I made, I talked about how the idea that communities are not just limited to cities. One of the things we're working on is with the business improvement district. If you think about the business improvement district, you know, up and down Hollywood Way with the Walk of Stars, there's a bunch of businesses up and down there, and they're all generally run as small independent businesses. So they have already, a lot of them have technology inside the store. If people come in the store, they're using technology for security. They use technology to run their point of sale terminals. They're using technology to do a lot of things. But the technology is limited to the data that the store owner can generate. And what we're working with the Business Improvement District on is, what if all these store owners could sort of collectively put their data together, not all of their data, I mean, point of sale data stays proprietary to the store, but selectively says, this is the data that I want to go into the common Business Improvement District data store. And then let's start running our analytics, our AI processes against that data. Now suddenly you get to do things like you can see, all right, here's the kind of people that are in the area. They're not right in front of the store, but they're moving up and down the store. So here's kind of the people we know in the area. If you have electronic display devices, maybe you change the displays that are in the store window to sort of highlight things that you think are going to be of interest to the people in the area. You can push coupons or specials to people who are walking in the area. You know, it is kind of interesting If you start looking at demographic people as people go through the area, the makeup of the people that are in the Hollywood district specifically, it changes pretty radically depending on the time of day. If you look at it in the morning, there's one type of people that are in the area. In the afternoon, there's sort of markedly a different demographic. And in evening, even again, it's even late afternoon it changes, then later in the evening it changes again. So you can think about that. And if you just sort of collect the data and say what kind of people were there in the last month, that's interesting, that's valuable data. But if you could able to say to people, here's the kind of people that are likely to be here between 3 and 5 o'clock, and then actually have data to say, whoops, look, something's going on. Maybe there's a parade that day, there's something going on. Here's what it is. And you can dynamically change your promotions, maybe what's on your menus, to sort of recognize the people that are there. That spells incremental business to all these stores. So that's kind of what we're trying to do and where we're trying to go with some of the things that we're doing. So it's really fascinating when you start thinking about how do you do this and how do you get people comfortable in a world where they're sharing their data, but not in a way that makes them lose control of the data. So obviously, it sort of tends to wrap it up a little bit, is that what we tend to tell people to do is not to focus on applications, but on systems that let you get your objectives. We want to make sure that the data ultimately over time becomes sort of real-time insights. And if you're a city or a community manager, it lets you become much more agile because you know exactly what's going on in the area that you're looking out for. Predictive analytics, absolutely important, but we want to go not just to be responsive, but anticipatory based on the conditions that are on the ground and noticed out there right there today. Certainly COVID is highlighting the fact that decision-making processes have to be driven by data, and that we need that not just gut feel, but we need science behind it, and that science has to be backed up by real-time collected data. We want to increase both resident engagement in the experiences. We think this does that, while at the same time improving operational efficiencies. The things that you have to do, this isn't a shocker that you have to pick up garbage off the street, but let's try and find a way to do that in a way that we're continually finding better ways to do that to make ourselves more efficient and do it. And of course, you can't do any of that unless you're focused on privacy and security. And not just the privacy and security. I know there's GDPR and CCPA and lots of requirements about that. But one of the things that we believe in is that sort of sets the minimum standard for what a company, what an organization has to do. And what we want to be able to do is support a process that's much more robust than that. So that's kind of where we're trying to get to. And again, a lot of what we're doing, if you go back and think about it, we're following the internet's evolution. For those of you who remember, I remember the early days of the internet, there were vampire clips. And what they actually did is some of the early internet applications, they deployed a coax up and down buildings. And what they would do is they would go in and have vampire clips that clicked in, and that's how you would click into the internet. That worked. Technically, you could pass data up and down between nodes, but when things broke, you couldn't figure out where things were. Over time, that sort of switched to token passing, and over time, token passing switched to the structured routers and hubs that we're familiar with today. And we think that in the networks that are created out of the Internet of Things are going to go through a similar evolutionary path. What we're trying to do at i3 Systems is really sort of accelerate that process and be a part of that evolutionary force on the front end of it. So that's kind of what we're trying to get to. It is kind of exciting. And I think as data scientists, everybody who's at this conference is actually in a cat's eyes, a bird nest seat to sort of watch and participate in this evolution that we're talking about. At the AI level for sure, at the data collection, the big data level, but even at the IoT layer and the network structure, the network that underlies it all. So I'm like really hopeful and excited about what lies in front of us. Let me put my emails up there if anybody does want to reach out and contact me. Should we switch and see if we have any questions?
Yeah, Thank you for the presenting. And we have some questions about our audience. So the first one is from Nan. He asked about what does I3 stand for. So I think he wants to ask that what's the specifically I3 roles in the business scenario. If you want to add more detail, then you feel free to add more, yeah, to our conversation. Yeah, thank you.
So I3, it's an acronym with an acronym inside of it, which is the recursive nature of acronyms is something only an engineer can appreciate. That was a joke. But it stands for the Intelligent IoT Integrator. So what it is about intelligently integrating IoT data together. It started with work that we first conducted at USC. It was sort of started as a USC research project, but as we worked with the city and other entities, the I3 concept evolved out of USC specifically and into something much more open called the I3 Consortium. The I3 Consortium is what worked on developing an open source version of the software that I've been talking about. That was released in December, so it's available if somebody wants to download it. What I3 Systems did is we took that open source and what we created was a much more industrialized, robust version of that software. So now there's an open source version if somebody wants it. If you're looking for a thing to do research, that's a great place to get started. But as you start moving your ideas from being a research idea into something that's deployed in production, you know that you're going to have a company like I3 Systems there behind it.
Yeah, I see. Yeah,
So,
thank you for answering the question.
Yeah, and if anybody's interested in well, either I3 Systems or the consortium, feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah.
The consortium's an open consortium, so there are government entities that are involved in the consortium. There are companies that are involved, and even individuals.
Sure. And the second question is, what leads smart cities around the world and their technologies can the city of LA look to model its own feature infrastructure and smart community?
So that's a really hard question to ask
Yeah,
and answer.
It's a big one.
It's a big one because there's no agreed to principle as to what's leading.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say who's leading. I know LA, the city of LA constantly wins awards for being one of the most digital cities in the world. The city of LA, though, is kind of, in my heart anyway, is special because when they think about how do we deploy technologies, they try thinking about, all right, before we deploy a technology, although we might start in one place, we want to be able to deploy technologies across the entire city. And if there's not a plan that lets them say, here's how we get there, it really sort of gets slowed down a little bit. And part of that is that the city of LA is really committed to making sure that technology doesn't create additional digital divides that separate us, so that there's not like technology have areas and technology have not areas. But there are lots of places of people who've done great things. There's examples of cities in Europe, in Asia. Some have sort of focused on how do we link databases together. Some have focused on specific applications like how do you identify gunshots in a city or smart street lamps. Others on parking applications. So there's a bunch of different cities that I think, depending on what your measure for, are you a leading city? Different cities could stand up and say that's me. But to my knowledge, I think Los Angeles is probably one of the cities that has one of the most holistic visions of where they want to go. And I know one of the things that we think about all the time is we think about like when the Olympics come to Los Angeles. Okay, now
Yeah.
we know where we're at today. I mean, even though the Olympics is 8 years away from now, we know that that's going to be a data-driven event, right? Every time somebody does something, it's going to be, there's data associated with that. When somebody, when traffic is going through the streets, they're going to need to use data to better manage traffic. All of that data is going to be there. Now, the trick is that the Olympics, when it's in the city, in LA, they're going to be events and hotels and people participating in the process spread over all 88 cities that make up LA County. So for the 2 weeks that the Olympics go on, basically these 88 cities plus the county, maybe some federal authorities, it has to function like it's one city, because you don't want something to happen in one city and have it mess up something going on the other end of the Olympic chain. So if you had to create an IoT, a data structure that supported 88 different cities, how do you put that together? It would probably, if you started today and you were really good to get a system what all these cities talk to each other, it might take you 3 or 4 years to do that. You have a 2-week event, and now it takes you another 3 to 4 years to put everything back to normal. I mean, that's just lunacy. So part of what we're trying to do is think about that as a driving scenario and create tools and environments that lets that happen much more easily, so that it almost becomes as simple as throwing a software switch. And while it's the city of LA that we're talking about, the Olympics, that same thing happens when there's a fire. How all of a sudden do we coordinate the data between all these places to manage a fire? Or COVID, now we have hotspots popping up all over the area. How do you get that data that's associated with the hotspot, pull it together, deal with it, even though it's independent data, and then use it to drive truly comprehensive response plans?
Yeah.
So it's a great question. But the end is, I think you got to end up thinking about holistically about the situation instead of individually.
Yeah, thank you for answering. And just like you mentioned, what you in this stay at home at this time, and do you have some project related to the COVID-19 and to transfer like some data to announce they do have the patient or not, or do you have some project related to right now situation?
So we've done some research work. It hasn't gotten too far yet. And right now, how do you manage COVID data is a relatively confined question. Well, I say that even though like sometimes between cities and states, it doesn't always work very smoothly, even in a constrained situation. But we look forward in our research. We were looking forward to the point where, like, a business owner might be doing COVID testing as people enter the business for his maybe employees, for his patrons. So instead of going to a county or a doctor to get COVID tested, you could get tested as you walk into the office every day. So if you start thinking about that's what this is going to be like, and if COVID lasts with us for a long time, that's a real scenario possibility. Now you've got data not just coming from a few testing centers, a couple dozen spread over the city, the county. Now you've got every business being a potential COVID testing center. And how do you manage and coordinate that data? So that's really a different magnitude of a problem. And that's something that we have been thinking about.
Yeah, it takes time. And from our audience, Jin, she has 3 questions. So the first one is, how is the operation funded? The government, you related to the government, and the test or the pay for the service, is the government pay for the service?
So how is it funded? So the consortium, the I3 consortium, is a grassroots organization. It's run as a nonprofit. People sign up and join, and they contribute money. But it's really what happens on I3. And I say it's a nonprofit. Some people, quite honestly, don't have a lot of money to contribute, but they have software talent or data analytics talent, and they'll contribute that to the process. But it's how do we start making the world a better place? On the I3 system side, we're set up as a corporation. So our end goal is ultimately to make profit, but we have a commitment to sort of drive part of the profits back into research and development, and to drive things into the city as well. So it's not, when I say it's a corporation, so we're trying to make money, but it's not one of those big bad businesses. We're actually kind of a soft good business, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So she had another question about who owns and acts. Oh, and I probably should add that tax for the data. I mean, if we make, when cities deploy I3, I probably should add this as well. The goal is always, how do you either improve services or how do you improve operational efficiencies? So if we improve operational efficiencies, and now maybe people don't have to go out and drive so much back and forth on the freeway, that's a cost savings. If you take the cost savings from that and put that into the technology, that helps the technology grow and go faster. So in the end, while it moves sort of budgetary line items around, it is intended to be budget neutral. So who owns access to the data? We take the position that the person who creates the data has rights, as both rights and responsibilities for who can see the data and what they can do with it. So that if you produce data privately, it's up to you to sort of say who can see your data and who can't see your data. So you have absolute control over it. And this is not an I3 thing. This is not they can't really anybody can't change that your authorization over the data. That also means, like, if you have data that's doing video, whether you produce it or not, I mean, you have a right and responsibility to make sure you're following the laws if you're producing your own digital data. But I think that's true in just about anything. So I think we sort of try to look at technology not as a new field, but as a reflection of the way we've always thought about privacy and security in the physical world. Just like data collected from IoT data should be a reflection of the real world, we're also looking at privacy and security in that same way.
Yeah.
So how is citizen involvement in the community projects? Citizens are free to come to I3 meetings. Quite honestly, when COVID hit, because we used to run conferences about every 2 or 3 months, and they were incredible conferences, quite honestly. But when COVID hit, we stopped doing that because you couldn't, and trying to replicate those networking experiences in a virtual world, we couldn't find a way to make that work real well. Because when you get people together talking about needs, wants, and desires, it's hard to sort of get that level of trust that get people to open up that you get when you're face to face to someone. So what we've had to do is we're revamping the whole I3 consortium process to make it much more virtual ready. And we're probably going to relaunch the program in new format and a new venue come January. And I've been working with the city of Long Beach, the city of LA, the county of Los Angeles, USC, and a few other people regularly to sort of try and reinvent what is the I3 consortium and how can we bring value in our new normal.
Yeah. Let's move to the next question. Is the mayor your first stakeholder?
We're currently, so I said we're created an industrialized, and I'm assuming her question is more from the I3 systems. We've created an industrialized, robust system. We are just finished the development of the system, so we're about to enter into beta tests with the city of Los Angeles. So yeah, it's an exciting time for us as a company. When you said you had data from traffic, is it a dynamic data? I'm reading through the other questions, and I'm assuming you'll tell me when I run out of time. So it's not, we don't have dynamic data yet. I'm actually playing with some dynamic crime reporting data from some of the cities. It is possible that it is set up to do that, but the data is not being dynamically released from the city. The city has their own privacy policies that they have to adhere to. And I say the city, meaning the city of Los Angeles. The rules that apply to another city, I'll say the city of Burbank or the city of Glendale, could be totally different. So the system has to be set up in a way that it respects the policy differences. We're not there to sort of say this is the right policy or this is the wrong policy, but whatever the city's policy is, this is the way that we would support it, and that stays relatively consistent. It is possible that the city of LA might sort of next week, well, that's kind of fast, but yeah, next week they might say, look, we're going to start releasing our data dynamically. They could do that. And we need to be ready as part of what we're doing. We built a system so that if the city decided that, we could support that in relatively quick order. Or alternatively, if the city said, if a different city was releasing dynamic data, if they decided, look, this creates a safety concern on the part of citizens, we're going to stop doing that. It should be really quick and easy to turn off the data from i3. I sometimes think of i3 as a plumbing system. I mean, if you think about the way plumbing systems are put together, there's a water main on the front of the street that turns on water on and off to the house. And when you turn the water main on or off, then you can sort of go to the faucets, fix them, change them, and do things like that. But part of what i3 does is it helps you sort of provide that level of control for the data streams that are flowing through a city or any other data community.
Yeah, collecting the dynamic data is one of the most challenging. Yeah,
it is hard, and when you think you've got the answer, somebody's gone in and changed the rules.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's really a thankless job. So hopefully, if we, as part of i3, can eliminate that roadblock and make it better for the data scientists, so that they can think about data science instead of the things that are right now a pain to them, that's a success for us.
Yeah. Let's move to another question.
Okay. What was the next question?
The next one is, can you consuperate be placated around the world? Be placated.
Yes. It can. We release it as open source. We're building the software so that it can be put anywhere in the world. In fact, last week I was talking to someone from Scotland who was very interested in what we're doing. Later this month, we have a couple of sessions at a NIST conference talking about what we're doing. It's an international conference, so talking about taking what we're doing here in LA and replicating some of the thoughts and ideas we have about how do you manage these complicated systems into other cities, both in the United States and around the world. We do have, I mean, actually, it's kind of interesting. Some of our development team is actually located in Europe. With COVID, everybody went to remote working. So whether somebody's in LA, from a developer's perspective, whether they're developing in LA or developing in Europe, it really didn't matter to us. So we immediately went out and started finding some really good people, and we didn't have to be location specific about our searches. So yeah, we think this ends up being a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Jerry. It's a great talk. So our next speaker, he's waiting in the conference room. So last question. I know there are, several questions in the Q&A window, but this is my question. Okay. US.
Yeah, and I know Ryan, he's a great guy, so I know this next talk's going to be a great talk.
Okay, so USC is a good school. Both of us, we used to work there, and I know USC has technology, several technology incubators, encourage the students to do a lot of stuff, project, entrepreneurship. You are very successful. You the I3, projects, started from the USA engineering school, and then now it's become a company. So from the point of view of entrepreneurship, in our idea community, we have a lot of students. They they are working at AI project, auto driving cars, data science, big data. They their skills. They have a dream about and entrepreneurship. So, do you have any suggestion for the graduate students or the young professionals how to leverage their the technology, their skills, to start their entrepreneurship?
So the biggest advice I would give is to, when you're thinking about problems, don't think about them from your perspective, but think about them from the other person's perspective. Okay. And that's more than just, when I say that, it's more than just taking a customer-centric view of the world, but understand that your customer has pressures, has issues, has things they're dealing with, whether it's finances or home life or whatever it is. But think about how the solution you're bringing solves a problem for the customer, but does it in a way that respects the environment that they're in. Because you're not gonna change that environment, so you have to find a way to make sure your solution is acceptable in their context.
Okay, very good, and thank you for your presentation. And definitely, I would like to arrange a meeting with you later. I know, a lot of our members, they are looking for project to work on, especially open source project and also the data projects. Okay.
Have them reach out or connect to me on LinkedIn if they don't have my email.
Very, very cool. Very, very cool. Okay. Thank you again to be, our speaker. And okay. So I would like to give the host to our session chair, Ira, today, to go to our next speaker. Jerry, thank you again.
Thanks, Jerry.